Hello, and welcome to the All Things Social Impact podcast. I'm Andrea Kanaris, your host, and today we're joined by Lara Mottee. Lara, welcome to the All Things Social Impact podcast. Rather than me speak for you, would you like to introduce yourself and tell the audience a little bit about what you do?
Sure. Thanks, Andrea. So lovely to be here speaking with you. I'm an academic researcher at the University of Sydney and working in the project management space, which sounds a little bit unusual maybe to be on an All Things Social Impact podcast. But I have a background in social impact assessment, environmental impact assessment. I worked for many years in consulting, engineering consulting. And that led me to start to ask some questions about how that process and what I did sort of fit within this wider project management process. So I landed working as a researcher in this space. I'm still quite focused on getting the best out of projects in terms for society, for planet, and so focused on social outcomes. But yeah, that's right now. That's my book. Yeah.
Fantastic. Excellent. Thank you for that. And so, because there are so many interpretations of what social impact actually is, if we can frame this conversation for our listeners, for our viewers, on what social impact means for you, then we can dive in nicely into your journey in social impact.
So for me, I've always thought of social impact as how projects interface with people and planet. So there's obviously a link with environment, even though, we often think about the physical environment in a very kind of way that we can kind of control, or we think we can kind of control, and, the things that we can see, those physical impacts. So for me, thinking about social impact is how a project or a development might feel to the people that are living in that community. And it might be how they feel about it might be really what they can see. It might be what they're wanting to see for the future, or for their family that might be growing up. So that, for me, I think really is what's at the heart of social impact. So sort of moving beyond those things that are tangible, that we can see in the environment, to those things that actually impact the way people run their lives on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, that's a great, nice framing. I think that allows us to dive into your journey and where it started. So how did you find yourself in a career in social impact work?
Yeah. I love this question because it's so fascinating to hear how people kind of get there, and it's definitely never a straightforward journey, I find. But I studied geography when I left school. I always knew that I wanted to work with people, but I hated the sight of blood. Medicine was never going to be for me.
Medicine out.
Yeah. And back then, though, there wasn't really social impact in Australia. It wasn't kind of a subject that you could kind of pick at university. So it wasn't even on my mind. But impact assessment definitely was. It was something that we did in geography at school. We were looking at impact assessments as part of our, geography coursework in high school. I always talk about my final project for geography, which was reviewing the EIS for the third runway at Sydney Airport, and I actually went and knocked on people's doors in my street to ask them about it. And I guess, I should have known then that I would end up in impact assessment. But I always, when I started my consulting career, because I studied human geography and that people interaction, the people land use kind of interaction, I always got the social bit of impact assessments. They always say, "Oh, Lara, you like the people bit," so you write the social impact assessment. But, it was never a social impact assessment. It was just like the social bit of the EIA.
Yes.
And so that kind of, sparked my interest in that. And I did a few qualifications in SIA along the way. And then, there was a point in my career where SIA started to actually become a real thing in that clients were asking for it. Like Roads and Maritime Service, I think was, in New South Wales was one of the first that kind of had guidelines, and they were really asking for it. And I thought, yes, this is my time. I can really dive in and use, these tools and really take the opportunity to talk to people. And then, the department, having been in New South Wales, the department picking up guidelines sort of 2017-ish.
Yeah.
And then from there, I ended up with a PhD in SIA, and
Yes.
I got the pleasure of working on the guidelines, the reformed guidelines that kind of came about. So yeah, that's kind of how I sort of led
Yeah.
that way. I was always
Wow.
passionate about the social impact assessment, but before it even existed, like as a
Yes.
formal kind of framing that we see today.
Yes. I think that's right. Really interesting because I could see some parallels. I mean, you were actually very early identified your interest in this
Yeah,
space. What was really interesting to me is because I think you're right. It's never because it's not such a it's a niche area. When you're talking social impact assessment, I think when you talk a broader definition, but the definition that you provided, it's quite niche. They're doing the impact assessment components of an EI. When you think the size of an EIS, which is
mm,
massive, like it's one of those little components. So it's very niche. It's not a straight line and it's not a direct, obvious way to get into
mm,
it. And I think your example was really good because it was a lot of opportunities arose. And because
yeah,
you knew you had an interest, you grabbed them. And that was a bit like me. I had gotten into it really early, but I think it was Sinclair Knight Metz, which is now Jacobs. But
yeah, yeah.
back in those days, I was doing it. I also did a little bit in government, took those opportunities, and it was just keeping an eye out until it really took off. And it's taken off in a way that I think a lot of us in the early days would have loved to happen, but it just wasn't there.
Yeah, yeah,
And
exactly.
now we're seeing it really establish itself as a valid career. We're talking, of course, about social impact assessment, social impact work more broadly, certainly been there for probably longer, I think, as an is like if you talk about social
Oh,
enterprises, if you talk
yeah.
about not for profits, which are definitely
Mhm.
social impact kind of work, but the social impact assessment, I think it's interesting. So you worked on the guidelines with Richard
Yeah, that's
Parsons.
right.
Obviously,
Yeah,
Richard
yeah.
Parsons, who my viewers will know because he was certainly one of my early guests. I think it was episode 3, if anyone wants to go back and listen to Richard. But you got to work with Richard on the guideline. I mean, was that one of your highlights? Have you got projects in particular that sort of stand out to you in terms of the social impact space? You mentioned the Sydney, doing it at school, which is amazing that you went out at school and actually did an impact
Yeah.
assessment of the runway in Sydney. That's amazing.
Yeah, look, definitely working with Richard was a highlight.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And getting that insight into the department and the other side and really feeling what those planners feel. They're stuck in the middle often, between communities, between
Yeah.
government or private sector. And in many ways, the private sector's much easier to kind of regulate. You can kind of talk to them. It's really hard when they're in this position of government, regulating government on what should be done. So getting that kind of insight behind the scenes. And there were lots of projects that we kind of worked on together. But the whole reason I started my PhD in SIA was because I wanted to understand why the impact assessments I was writing were not having the impact that I desired or I had intended through the evidence that
Right.
I was putting forward in these documents. And it wasn't just, SIAs, it was just the impact on people, but
Yeah.
not the negative impact. They were doing a great job of ameliorating, majority of those impacts. It was this
Yeah.
kind of longer term, the broader strategic kind of aims, of these projects. And even
Mm.
though as the regulator, we were putting conditions in to put more and more checks, I feel like, to make sure that these outcomes were being achieved, was still really hard to see them being translated on the ground.
Yeah.
And monitoring processes were also kind of a real challenge for both practitioners and communities.
Yeah.
So seeing that they were actually happening, there's a lot of pressure, I think, on local governments then as the kind of recipient of some of the kind of complaints and then
Yeah.
the opportunities that should be celebrated in these big projects to improve well-being or whatever it is, give the communities what they need to get the future that they want. But that's often just wasn't happening. And
Yeah.
so, the couple of case studies I picked, one of them was the Southwest Rail Line, which was a small kind of
Yeah.
rail project down in New
Yeah.
South Wales. And then, so I'm up in Toowoomba now. I probably should have said that in my introduction. I'm not too far up the road from you, as
Oh,
we
you're up
say.
the road.
But yeah, so when I was working with Richard, obviously I was in New South Wales working in the New South Wales
Yeah.
Department of Planning. But yeah, so that, that was kind of a smaller project. And then also I was looking at the predecessor to Sydney Metro on the line that was the Epping to Chatswood rail line, which doesn't exist anymore. So talk about a money well spent. But anyway, I think actually that the Sydney Metro is a great thing. It only got pulled out after 10, 15 years after it going in. And so I'd come from this scenario of these sort of projects, and I thought in my PhD I wanted to see what other parts of the world were doing, and I actually got to spend quite a bit of time in Amsterdam.
Lovely.
And really kind of comparing, the way that they do things compared to the way that we do here. But what I found was they didn't have social impact assessment, and they didn't have impact assessment at all when projects are within the urban environment. Their law was kind of set so that it was, if there's no nature, then the kind of need for an impact assessment is extinguished, and that the impacts, the interface impacts, I should say, of projects could be regulated through a permitting system.
Right. So are you saying that the impact assessment component was purely driven by the environmental component and nothing at all to do with the human components?
No, exactly. But they do have, and there's a really specific reason for that, is because the engagement laws are set up with so much power to the voice, the local person, so it wasn't loading up, I guess, the impact assessment process. They have a way of continuously engaging with communities through their urban planning and their planning practices, so that when it gets to the project, it shouldn't be a surprise. It shouldn't be this kind of scenario where they've not heard of it before, because they've been engaging communities about the future of the city, the future they want to see, the values they want to see, what's important to them. And for me, that was really powerful, and I remember...
And that's great to hear, but I have a question, if you don't mind me interjecting, because when I was listening to that, I was like, it reminded me, though, of how does that play out in terms of the difference between communications, which makes people comfortable because they know what's coming, and perceptions do not necessarily equate to impacts. So does that mean that they actually have mechanisms in which to ensure that the direction they're going isn't actually having unintended consequences or impacts to the community that they're going to miss because they're just going, well, we're communicating really well and everyone's happy, and
so the case study I looked at was the North-South Metro line, and exactly that happened. And I think that, the Metro line is in now, and it's quite successful according, to their patronage numbers.
Yeah.
Although, you might get a different kind of discourse from local Amsterdammers who might say, well, we missed, the bus. We preferred the bus going on the north side than having to wait for a metro because there's only two metro stations on the north side and I have to walk all this way or get the bus to the metro station, So these kind of unintended effects, do happen, and they are hard to kind of capture and action. And I think one of the fundamental things that went wrong in the engagement, I suppose, on this project, which resulted in them having an absolute overhaul, was the fact that they assumed they had the trust of the community, because they had they had just kept saying, we're saying that there's not going to be any problems with this project. There's going to be, everyone's safe. It's going to be great. They kept spinning this kind of story without actually translating the risks, the technical risks. It's actually quite topical, given that 7 News yesterday put this sort of little news clip out about the tunnel collapse in the M6. I don't know if you saw that yesterday. But, the M6 in New South Wales has been having this sort of geotechnical collapse issue, and they put a drone in there, and so it's a really interesting footage of the tunnel collapsing and them knobbing out.
Track it down. I hadn't seen that.
You have to have a look at that. But essentially, it's the same thing happened on the on the Amsterdam Metro project. And when that happened, that's when they lost trust, because they'd been telling them this whole time, the project's going to be great. There's no risk with this tunneling. And then they stopped the whole project for a year. And then after that, when they finally got the okay to go back again, they completely changed the way that they were doing engagement.
I actually find that this is just a perfect example, listening to what you were saying, that highlights why I say what I always say, is that social impact assessment, whilst the community engagement is critical, it's really important, it informs, it
Yeah,
is not in itself an understanding of impacts. It is applied social research to dig down deep
exactly.
into, yes, the perceived impacts, but also the actual impacts.
Yeah,
That may be related to design, it may be related to activities through construction, and you need both. Like, I would never advocate that you've done a social impact assessment, so you don't need to
yeah,
your community in an ongoing way. And I certainly wouldn't advocate that if you're talking to your community all the time, that you don't need to do a social impact assessment. Because from my experience, and I think you've given two examples of pretty much the same thing, where um, the assumption was wrong. And you know what they say about assumptions, though.
yeah.
So, you know, assumption. I mean, the minute you're making an assumption, you probably sit there and sort of lean back and go, should I be assuming? Maybe I need
Yeah.
to look in.
And it's such a fantastic case. You know, look, it shouldn't have taken something as tragic as, you know, some houses nearly falling in a hole to make it happen. But after that, they were way more transparent, you know, and they were well, maybe even too much, you know, knocking on people's doors saying, we're going to be doing this at night, we're going to be doing that. Or, you know, we have to, one of the cases that there's some great pictures of is, you know, we have to put in a sewer bypass. And look, you know, we could do this wiggly kind of pipe
Yeah.
along the road, or we could elevate it and decorate it because it's Christmas time. And the community was like, yeah, let's do that. We'll turn it into a Christmas tree, this pipe. And just a small thing that actually went, okay, well, why don't we just ask them? What,
Yeah.
you know, if we can't do it, we say no, but we've asked them, and it makes them feel like they're a part of what's going on in their neighbourhood.
And
You know,
that's a
by this point,
example.
it's been
Yeah.
going, 10 years in some of these
Yeah.
neighbourhoods? Like, kids are never not known
Yeah.
construction for this metro line. Like, that's a really long time, you
That's
know.
like our Cross River Rail up here. Like, it's just, it just seems to go forever. I remember having
Yeah.
somebody at Morningside say, you know, oh, they're upgrading our Cross River Rail station. And she said it shouldn't be, it'll be ready by here. And I just laughed and went, okay.
Yeah,
And I
exactly.
said, they've been upgrading my station for a very long time. It
Yeah.
definitely did not hit the deadlines. So
Yeah,
yes, there are kids who have grown up with the construction of some of these larger projects, and that's
exactly.
the reality of it, isn't it? So understanding the impacts and consequences to communities is important just for that reason. That you've got
Mhm.
people who are living, we're not talking about 1 or 2 years or 6 months construction. We're talking really long periods of
Yeah,
time where people's lives are, like you said, the interaction between project and community goes on for rather prolonged periods of time that are significant. So
yeah,
that's really important. And I can think of,
mm,
I'm sure everyone can think of
yeah.
something that they've come across. Yeah.
And one of the things that has been really interesting moving up to Toowoomba is that there's a sign as you come up the range here,
Yeah.
off the Warrego, that says fast rail for Toowoomba. And when I moved here, I thought, okay, so I wonder how long that sign's been up. Or, you know, who put the sign up? And I sort of asked around, and it's one of those things that has been promised for so long.
Yeah.
And, you know, the state government did put a report out, a sort of white paper last year, I think it was.
Yeah.
But the community here is like, well, that's just never going to happen. Like, oh, great, they put out another white paper. But, you know, there's been so okay, there's a white paper. Why couldn't there have been some engagement around that white paper?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, and I know as part of the the Southeast Queensland mayors in the lead up into the bid for the Olympics,
Yeah. Okay.
certainly the fast rail for
Yeah.
Toowoomba and Sunshine Coast and Gold Coast were all, the concept was that, you know, it's more interconnected and the travel between them would be more
Yeah.
efficient and quicker and more connected. So, and the fast rail for Toowoomba was in that from
In
my
that one. Yeah. Okay.
recollection. But it has been bouncing around, like you said,
Yeah.
for a very long time. Has as the Gold Coast, as has the Sunshine Coast
Sunshine Coast, that's right, yeah.
as well, because anyone who drives from Brisbane to the Sunshine Coast, which I've got to do on Friday to have lunch, which I'm very much looking forward to her. What I'm not looking forward to is the drive up there because it's always a nightmare. It's a longer
Yeah,
journey,
yeah.
but I'll brace
And
myself for that.
I mean, and here as well, like if you want to get to the airport, so there is a Wellcamp Airport, there is a Toowoomba Airport, and you fly, there's 2 flights, I think, or 1 flight a day, something like that. And it's not every day, and it's in a small plane, and it's flying to Sydney is the flight I'm talking about, but there are also other regional flights.
Yeah,
Melbourne doesn't fly anymore. So if you want to go to a capital city, you need to get to Brisbane. Now, there's an equity thing here because the only way to get to Brisbane if you don't have a car is to get the Murray's bus or the Greyhound bus, right?
yeah,
And so then that takes 2 hours or longer, depending on, the time of day of your flight. And then that stops at night around 7 o'clock. So you can't take any of the later flights, which are generally
no,
cheaper. And then you can't also take any of the morning flights, which are
no,
also generally
correct.
cheaper. Now, I mean, I don't know the business case for the fast rail. I assume it's not the high speed rail, which probably will have a higher ticket attached. But, it's just normal fast rail that people maybe in other places are used to, but it's just not like right now, like the train it's like 6 hours or something, 4 or 6 hours. You wouldn't want to do it.
No,
And, you wonder because you think, okay, strategies are made thinking, oh, yeah, it would be great for efficiency and with the Olympics coming up. But
yeah,
what do people in Toowoomba feel like? What is fair for
it's
people in Toowoomba? What do they want for their future? Do they want to be more connected? Do they want options, to be
yeah,
able to get to the airport? Or is it something that they don't want? They don't want to be, connected, or they're concerned about, that we've got housing shortages across Australia. So is that engagement that I think that social impact assessment has a power to do, to get that little bit deeper into some of these issues.
And
Yeah.
maybe this is because of my background, and you, like me, have worked in government, not just in the
Yeah.
social impact assessment space, in the consulting world. I've always believed, and I have applied, I guess, the same skills when I was doing policy, health service planning, planning in government, regulatory work. I'm a believer that social impact assessment should be utilised more frequently by government when they're developing strategies, service plans, health service
Yeah.
plans, strategies across the state and across Australia, because that's where that would demand exactly what you're talking about. Going into these towns in Queensland in particular, like having worked like you in New South Wales and in Queensland, is that the communities, and same with Victoria, the communities in Queensland are uniquely different than just about any other state. We have a very dispersed community. We have more regional, rural and remote communities than any other state. And some of those are very small, and some of them have some of the most vulnerable
Yeah.
communities in the
That's
country.
right.
So there's really complex issues, and the issues are addressed by siloed organisations. So health services are a problem, education is a problem,
That's
transport
right.
and main roads is a problem, roads, So
Yeah.
like then, social impact assessment is certainly a mechanism that cuts across those issues, but
Mm.
also that interface with the community, like you said, in the location where the services or the project or whatever needs to be provided. And I think that you make a really fantastic point. And when you were talking, I was thinking, God, these little places were coming up in my head, like Mount Tambourine,
Yeah.
it's so close to the Gold Coast, so close to Brisbane, but you can't get a bus.
No.
And if you do, the bus takes you to a train station, and you have to get on the train station to either the Gold Coast or to Brisbane. And that's if
Yeah.
you've got a medical appointment, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
With a
Yeah.
specialist. And we're not talking about having to go far outside of Brisbane before you start to see problems in terms of access, like you said.
Yeah.
Uh, Good access to services, infrastructure. So there are important issues that need to, and I agree with you. I think social impact has there's an opportunity for it to really enhance our planning a lot
Yeah.
better than what we're using it now. It
Yeah.
should be project by project for proponents, government can really embrace it, I think, and start thinking of it in that way.
There was I mean, I won't say who it was, but there was a wonderful impact assessment planner in my research that said, in an ideal world, urban planning wouldn't need impact assessment because we do it, as part and parcel of the way that we plan.
Correct.
And I just thought, wow, I never thought
Yeah.
about that before. Like if we just planned it, with a minimum impact, knowing that a project is going to intervene, like it's going to have be an intervention into the world, the system, the local environment, then, do you need to tick that regulatory box? It often becomes
Well, I think you could be a lot.
impact assessment,
I think you could certainly be a lot lighter on. So what I mean by that is you're thinking of the risks really early, and then as the process goes, you're gathering the information and thinking about the consequences at every stage, and you're not waiting until it's I've got a project and I've designed it and now I want to get approval. It's too late. And also the government should kind of already have an idea of where they want these services, where they want. So, if and social impact mindset, I would call it, not necessarily because then you need social impact process. To me, I see it as the best way I could probably put it is seeing it as a toolkit of things that a good social impact practitioner would have under their belt, that they would draw on the right ones depending where they were in development. Is it a thought bubble? Are we looking about just high level social risks? Are we starting to get a detailed design? Okay, well, we need to do some co-design, right? These are the toolkits that sit within, I think, social planner, social impact professional, that I think can be used at every single stage. And I think whoever told you that, very insightful. And that's exactly how I think about it when I say governments should really be proactively doing this. And then, you can then lighten and have a lighter touch regulation because you can have a lot more confidence in the decisions that are being made. And you've already got a lot of data that can be shared and you're not having to replicate everything for sure.
I agree with you absolutely. And I'm hoping that I might be able to do a bit more research into this space, but sort of looking beyond the project-based impact assessment. Things like the renewable energy zones, which are being picked up from New South Wales, Queensland now as well, and across the country. These are a great example where you need to be thinking about this wider kind of system early on, all the projects as all together, or impacts more broadly. I mean, we don't have that much emphasis on strategic environmental assessment, perhaps like they do in Europe, which is where it's legislated. But that type of tool,
Canada do strategic.
Canada as well. And I don't know if you know why, but I don't know why it hasn't been so popular, whether it's been the fragmented states and wanting to do their own thing and be different. But I mean, I know that they implemented it at the federal level, but why are we not, surely these renewable energy zones are kind of the perfect example where we could be.
Queensland did do a strategic assessment for the res. How
maybe learning from New South
Wales have been a little bit removed from it, but they did do a strategic one because they were slower in picking it up. The advantage of being able to do a strategic assessment to learn from other states. My problem with some of this renewable stuff is the speed at which we're moving. It's sometimes you need to go slower to go faster. Going fast, we're going to miss I fear we're missing too much. Some of the noise on the ground. I know New South Wales had some problems. I was working in some of the northern parts of New South Wales around in the res zones where they were just being hammered, and the slowing down would have really benefited because they would have understood better where the zones should be, or even the pace of which the projects were implemented across the zones. But it was interesting. I would like to see, like you say, the strategic assessments, but also don't be in such a rush.
Exactly. I mean, I know we have targets. It's there's lots of layers of bureaucracy and policy and regulation and all sorts of things happening with these projects. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be thinking like strategically about it. That's the whole point of it being a I guess, a zone, and it's not an individual project kind of format, which is what
Yeah.
was sort of happening previously. You know, there was one project here, one project there. I think one of the projects I worked on, there's lots of wind farms down in South Australia, you know,
Yeah.
that I worked on when I was working in consulting, things like that. So it's not like renewable projects haven't been happening. They were always there, but why, you know, now that we're coming up with these zones, are we in such a rush to kind of deliver them without putting the proper kind of engagement in place and impact assessment, you know,
Yeah.
early on? Like waiting for the regulatory process rather than being proactive about this.
Yeah.
Which is I think that's something that they definitely do differently in the Netherlands. I mean, it can get burdensome for them, the level of engagement that they do really early on in this kind of
Yeah.
planning. I think it still gets them kind of better outcomes on projects. The other thing I wondered, you know, like, why do we not vote perhaps, you know, in some way for different projects? You know, why do we not test community kind of acceptability for projects before we send them all the way down? You know, we kind of assume this, like, that
Well,
people want them, but
I don't know how that would work. So my
yeah,
problem with that, conceptually it sounds really great, but we do live in a democracy, and one would hope that our population are voting for the policies of the party that's in, and when you're voting for
yeah,
their policies, you do know what's coming.
yeah,
So it's
hope.
then about that's what it should be, right? So if people are saying they didn't know, it's like, well, were you paying attention at the election? Because their policy now, there is the bit that sometimes politicians don't their promises.
You won't
I
take
get
that.
that, but here's the problem: do we just want to add layers and layers and layers and layers? Because
Mm.
whilst I'm all saying let's go slower to go faster, then you can just put in too much that we just clog up the system to the point where you can't progress.
Yeah,
And you know, live in a democracy any day over any other structured
yeah,
society.
agree with you
But
there.
we do have to be careful that we don't over consult and get stuck in this consultant
Mm.
vortex where we're just sitting there constantly having a talk fest about what we think. And because you're never going to get full agreement. I think anyone who's done a social impact assessment will know this.
Yeah,
Never people
exactly.
are going to agree on everything. There's always going to be people who don't like where it's going. They're not going to like the project that goes ahead. They're not going to like the decision that gets made because they're maybe in the minority. So the best you can do is try and get consensus from the majority of people. So if you voted in a way, you're voting for the policies. To me, the social impact assessment, the environmental impact assessment is to making sure that there are safeguards to make sure that we do that well, that we don't do it in a
Mm.
way that
Yeah,
is shoddy, that doesn't consider the protection of our environment, or that ill-thought ones get caught.
yeah,
Because, you know, to me, that's the safety net from the democracy of what we're saying, that you're
yeah,
voting
yeah,
for policies, and the EIS and the SIAs and all the other ones where you catch those projects that maybe shouldn't have been in that policy in the first place.
yeah,
But stepping back, if you go back and you do policy and strategy properly and you're looking from that lens, hopefully you minimize that even happening anyway.
yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, I don't think there's a huge number of projects that get into the impact assessment and get cancelled, though, unfortunately. But, you know, I think it's also, there is a role, like you say, to make sure that nobody is worse off as a result of a project. You know, while there might be layers of more engagement, you know, there's also layers of more engagement if a project ends up in litigation and it ends up in a
Yeah.
public hearing.
Yeah.
So you also don't there's a balance to be struck to make sure that nobody is worse off. And I think that, yeah, like you say, the impact assessment is often that place where you do kind of catch them, but it would be really good if it was much earlier, because once they're kind of in that impact assessment process, especially government projects, it's almost kind of never that I've seen that they get cancelled. I think in that time I worked in consulting, there was one project that got cancelled that we were writing the impact assessment for, which was one of the water projects, taking water from Straddie. when I worked up in Queensland. But yeah, it's very rare. You don't often see
I,
projects get into the
And I
impact
think that
assessment.
sometimes that's because the vetting process. So if we're coming out as the government now, like a lot of the time,
Yeah,
the vetting of these projects is done in the pre-feasibility. So before it goes to the
exactly.
planning approval. So I think that's something that a lot of people miss, and that a lot of the public aren't aware about a lot of the time,
Yeah, yeah,
depending on how well they communicate. Now, I've worked with companies that do communicate with their communities well on the pre-feasibility, but a lot of projects get abandoned at that pre-feasibility because they don't
yeah,
stack up. And
exactly.
if you can't design out the issue, then it doesn't stack up, right?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
that's probably why by the time you get into the planning, the kind of issues that would exist around environment or planning or noise or interface with communities are not things that can't be mitigated,
Yeah, you'd hope.
which is for the most part, which is probably why we don't see that many that get cancelled. Although we are seeing, but I don't think the point of impact assessment should be, it's not an advocacy position or role. Like when I go into a community, I have to be completely
Mm,
neutral. My
yeah,
personal opinion
exactly.
about the
Yeah,
project is irrelevant. It is to actually put a lens on what the impact is. So our intent shouldn't be to try and stop projects. Our intent is to understand the impacts and can they be mitigated. Now, if something comes up and
yeah,
it's such a big impact and it would have devastating effects on a community, and I've been involved in one as a expert for in court, where my position was that yeah, it is. And in that instance, then the push should be to maybe we need to
yeah,
reconsider whether this project is actually viable
yeah.
and can continue. But that's a very different lens than coming in thinking that there should be that using that, or that engaging in the impact assessment is about stopping a project, because I think that's the
Mm,
wrong way to approach it, particularly from a practitioner. I mean, I think
yeah, you're
if
right. That's
you're
one of the hard issues
it's an
in terms
ethical
of
issue,
ethics.
I believe. And
Exactly. Yeah. It is one of those hard ethical issues, you know, feeling confident to be able to stand up when to say something when it's you think that there is an unacceptable impact, you know, and it might cost a project to redesign or change a different
yeah,
way, or, you know, in the case of like the Amsterdam Metro that I was talking about, they
yeah,
in one of the earlier versions of the project, it was going through a different neighborhood and people sort of stood up protest and it got moved to another neighborhood, which,
yeah,
you know, in that wasn't actually a positive outcome for the other neighborhood, which was a lot poorer and didn't have the
yeah.
voice to be able to speak up.
This
But
is the
there
problem.
also there wasn't the impact assessment, you know, on that project.
Yeah.
There wasn't anything in between what the government was deciding in that case was best and the people that were able to
Yeah.
be have the voice and the wealth to be able to stand up and stop a project.
And this is the problem with
Yeah,
I know some people get offended by the NIMBY tag or the not in my backyard
yeah,
tag. And my response to that is it is a real thing. And the problem with it is that there's an infrastructure that is needed for society. So coming back to our thing about when you
yeah,
vote for things, there are certain things that as a society we need. There'll be hospitals, there'll be roads, there'll be, energy projects, pipelines, a full
exactly.
array of things that we all want and need. So I would say some of it's wants, but most of it is we need it to function in a modern society that we've designed. The problem is that you don't have a social impact assessment that is actually driven by the data and the information around what the impacts are. Then you fall into a case where you're relying on the community engagement and it gets hijacked by people who are not in my backyard because they're the ones who have the money, have the time. And like you said, then what it gets shifted to somebody who is a community
Yeah,
that's more vulnerable, the impacts will be potentially worse. Maybe they're the same, but potentially worse. But the problem with it being in a community where they're more vulnerable, as you know, is that the more vulnerable you are, the less likely you are to be able to manage and cope with those impacts. So the
exactly.
decision shouldn't be
Yeah,
around, I don't want it and I just have more money, so I'm going to make more noise. There's the squeaky
mm,
wheel effect that NIMBYs are very good at. The NIMBY approach is very good at. That's my concern with that, is that it ends up
mm,
in the scenario that you pointed out, in a lower socioeconomic, that's not empowered, that hasn't got the resources to actually state their case. And if there's no impact assessment, there's probably not even an opportunity to actually articulate properly what their concerns would be. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, In that case, I think sometimes we can, as planners, become advocates, advocates for the community or for the little guy or for those that are more vulnerable. And that is really difficult place to be. And that's why I said I felt that, when I was working at the department, the planners there were often stuck right in the middle,
Yeah.
because the people that were writing the impact assessment were writing that because their client is paying them to. And so, they were taking a neutral sort of position on the project itself. And then it really called for the planners within the regulator, like in the department, to kind of step in and go, no, this isn't okay. This is not doing the right thing. And working in consulting was definitely challenging with deadlines. But I just think that that ethical kind of duty that they have to the public working in that role, I just think it's incredible. The government.
Yeah, it is, and it's a tough one. And I think there's a systemic, and you point to what I call a systemic issue around where social impact sits, and the whole EIS, to be honest, all of it, the environment as well.
Exactly. Yes.
I think that I've heard people say, oh, it needs to scrap. Is it flawed? I don't think EIS is flawed or social impact assessment is flawed. I think it's a very robust, done well. It's extremely effective. I think the same with environmental statements. I've worked with these environmental professionals. I know that they're very good at their job. There's a systemic problem though. And I would like to see a sort of pseudo government, if you like, that's partly funded by proponents and by the industries and by government, that runs independently, and either they procure the social impact assessment or the EISs from there as actually, because then it's not the proponent funding it, right? That removes that barrier, that issue, and then the methodologies and the timeframes can be set in what is acceptable for the risk to the project, as opposed to by the budget of a proponent.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, they could there's two ways that they could go in that instance. They could either hire people who can do environmental and social impact assessments, or they can procure them, like I said, become a kind of procurement body and oversight and part of the peer review processes, right? But that would remove what I see as the intrinsic problem that you point to, which is here you've got this planner sitting in government who's got to look at this report, but they also know that the practitioners that have written it, or the enviro firm or whoever has written it, has had limitations put on them, be it because the proponent may or may not want to really thinks that environmental or social impacts aren't that important, or whether it's because their budget says they only want to spend X amount of dollars in X amount of time. So all of those things affect the quality and the data collection and the depth of knowledge that should sit in that document. And then it's the planners trying to figure out, how much of this is accurate, a full accurate reflection of the impacts for the community.
Exactly.
That creates a really terrible position for the people who are trying to approve those.
It really does.
Systemic problem.
Yeah. And I also think, through our working groups at the university, through the John Grill Institute, where I work right now, there is also a move towards thinking about outcomes from projects, not just outputs of projects, output being the delivery of an A to B piece of infrastructure, but that these outcomes need to be thought out in advance and actually costed in business cases, if that's what the outcome is that you want to achieve from a project, it needs to be appropriately budgeted. So that can also happen in the impact assessment process, because as designs kind of develop, they think, oh, we want to get this better outcome or that better outcome. Or they want to change something, which then gets fed into the impact assessment. But if it's in there, the change is the worst. I see your face there. You agree when they change the design. Don't change the design on me.
Stop changing everything.
Please don't change the design.
Although
but they are
change design.
They're going with the concept, they're going.
Sometimes that's the point. That's the downside of the co-design process, right? Is it does mean that they will change the design and you'll have to go back out again. Yes.
Yeah, so, also tapping into that kind of business case, which we're seeing high-speed rail. I don't know if you've been looking at any of the work that the High-Speed Rail Authority's been doing with the first bit of line that they have between Sydney and the Central Coast, but I think it's amazing that they're only in the business case and they're already talking to communities. They're actually on the ground talking to communities. And I
Yeah.
think they've set up an office now in Newcastle. I assume they were going to when I last spoke to them. And that's in my career, that's pretty unheard of. Like in the business case, like they've been brave enough to go to the community, in that space.
I think there's enough evidence to suggest that that's the right way to do it. I have, like I said, in the pre-feasibility where they're building the business case for investment in their project.
Yeah.
I've worked in mining and resourcing projects where they do that.
Definitely in
And
mining and
they're
resourcing.
definitely talking to community. They're definitely talking to the stakeholders to understand. And then I think there's a lot of fear about doing it, but in fact, it's really holds you back. Like I said, it might slow you up in the beginning, but you will get wins as you go down the line, because it's going to allow you to go faster, because the community understand the risks. They know that they've been informed the design. They understand that as you go through the process, it's a lot smoother, it's a lot quicker, and you're fine-tuning instead of identifying problems that are hard to fix now, because you've kind of got a final design, and you can only tinker at the edges. Or it's such a fatal flaw that it doesn't get picked up, like you said, and then you've got a tunnel that's kind of like having to send drones in after it's operational. Like, no one wants to be there.
No, absolutely.
So I think that I hope we will see more and more of that in more industries.
Yeah, I agree.
In more industries understanding the importance of actually getting it right, using co-design early, and thinking of these things as a business case. So I, for example, in Queensland at the moment, as you know, the community benefit agreements and the SIAs are going through in the bill for the renewable energy projects. And I know that I advocated last year, and I continue to advocate a business case model where social impact assessment should be informing business cases for how you deliver your project for benefit for a community. So if you're going to have a community benefit agreement or community benefit fund, or I advocate investment fund, forget the grant funding. If you want to do charitable stuff, carve off some money for that, but think from an investment point of view for your community, because I find it interesting that, and this when you work with proponents in the private sector, every other part of their business would require a business case for spend, right? What are the outcomes we expect from this investment? They get to the community and all of a sudden their business brain goes out the window and they go, that would be nice, let's do that. And they're throwing this money and then wondering why the community are dissatisfied. It's like, well, because of course they're taking your money, because who wouldn't take money that someone's offering them?
Yeah.
Like, that's a crazy, of course they're going to take it. You feel good in the short term because you've given all this money. But then when someone comes in and reviews, you've got this company that go, we don't trust them, they're not doing this and they're not doing that. And it's like, well, if you just spent the time of doing a business case, understanding the community, the impact on the community, the things that they aspire to, the things that they want to do, like you said, what are their aspirations, where do they want to go, what's their future look like, and how can the project help them to do that, and then invest in that community based on that knowledge instead of grant funding. May or may not benefit, or it might benefit a handful of people, but not the broader community as a community as a whole.
Yeah, definitely. So bringing that outcomes focus, I guess, earlier, but having an agreement on what are the outcomes that you want to achieve sometimes can be a part of that battle as well. But you're not going to find out, unless you treat communities as an equal stakeholder when you're putting your business case together, on par with your scope, your time, all the other kind of metrics that go into measuring what project success is. And you've got your client as a stakeholder that you're reporting to if you're leading a project, but you're not thinking about people, the communities as a stakeholder that you're reporting to. That's traditionally not the way in which business cases are developed. And I think that's a movement that kind of needs to happen, elevating the role of the stakeholder, the citizen, taking their expertise as a valid piece of kind of evidence that supports the decision that's being made much earlier on in this kind of business case. Because, you're not going to, how can you judge whether a project's been valuable at the end for communities if you never included them in the first place. It's like having a false baseline because you haven't actually asked them in the first place what they would like to kind of achieve. And, success is different to different, means something different to different people. So, so you've
And
got
it's
that.
not even about, and it's not even about having everybody in the community on board or everybody in the community
No.
approving your project. Maybe your stakeholder, maybe your community that you need to invest in is small because it's going to be proportionate to, proportionate to your impacts, proportionate to the size of your project and the investment you need to make. But if you're going to be giving funds to communities, corporate social responsibility, we've seen these funds, we've seen these kind of community benefit agreements, and they come in all sorts of forms. But if you're going to do that, invest in the community. If you're going to spend money in the community, make sure that there is a return on that investment in terms of, like you say, outcomes that the community can get on board with. That is about what's important to them as a community.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And it may not be something that's immediate. It may be something that's, sort of future generations or even within a generation, but as the generation is aging. And I think that can be a bit uncomfortable for people that are investing. They may not want to, I'm not going to get my return on investment for 20 years or, that can be a hard kind of sell.
Well, this is where I think it needs to be proportionate to the project. There are some projects where an investment for 20 years makes sense because the project's long term, right? So it makes sense. There are some that are smaller and not that longer term that maybe that isn't unreasonable. And you say, well, you have to put, like anything, you scope out what is relevant and appropriate for the investment and for, I guess, the consequences associated with it. It doesn't mean that the investment needs to be tied to the impacts. Maybe they are, maybe they're not, but it does have to be proportionately relevant, because it would be unreasonable to ask a company to start investing massive amounts of money in relation to their project. They're going to go, they would book, but there are ways to do it, I think, and I think most people are reasonable. Sure, you're going to have people who always want more, but I think for the most part, people are reasonable. If you bring them on the journey and they understand and you're talking to them and they trust you and they can see that you're being transparent, most of them would be quite happy to work with you around scoping what that might look like for their community. That's been my experience. That ones that do it well have a lot easier time in negotiating what those outcomes for that community might need to look like.
Exactly,
And they're far more accepting when you have to say no to things as well, because they know that you'll say yes when you can and no when you can't. And I think that relationship's important to build, and it doesn't happen overnight. So if you come in late, you're going to struggle.
Yeah. Come in late and come in with it. This is happening and you don't get any choice, but, let's negotiate. That's not going to go down too well. No, not at all.
So that's been a really lovely, rich conversation. I've really enjoyed that. And as we close, because I'm conscious of the time, I just wanted to ask you if we can just quickly go, favorite project that you've worked on that you've had that you found most rewarding, or maybe it's one where it went so horribly wrong, you go, this is the one that I've had the most lessons on. And maybe you've got both.
Oh, look, I always talk about a couple of projects actually in the Northern Rivers that I worked on with RMS, with their northern region up there. They were just all credit to the project director on the RMS side and our project director when I was working at KBR as well. They spent just the process that they went through. So it was probably the most memorable is the Sportsman's Creek New Bridge. Little small community at Sportsman's Creek. They needed to replace the bridge that was there due to lead paint and put a new one in. And we literally started with a box, the river, the community and a box, and said, okay, we need to get you guys from one side to the other. It's an important cane route, so it can't be, too small, because we've got the big trucks that need to go over. But, what do you need? And we started with this box, and we had the local council member in there in that design meeting. We had, all the engineers, community engagement, and that's how we designed the project. And we started from there. And then in the end, the community was so happy. We built a model of the previous bridge that was there. They were able to retain part of it
Yeah.
so that you could go stand there and view and look at the creek, which was now all opened up because that bridge was gone and the new bridge was a bit further downstream. So there was a sort of heritage piece as well around that. And just for me, it was just such a feel good project, and that I
Yeah.
was really proud of, to be a part of, to see it from beginning to end. There was even microbats in the bridge that we were able to save. So yeah, for me, that was just one of the most wonderful projects that I always love talking about as a great example of how we
Yeah.
really thought about people and environment
Yeah.
very, very from the beginning, before we even had a concept or anything,
I love
Yes.
that. I really love that because it also demonstrates that it doesn't have to be complex. It doesn't
Yeah.
have to be big and flashy. It can just be pragmatic, practical, and with respect for what's
Yeah,
important to the community, what they value the
exactly.
most. Yeah,
Yeah.
that. Well, that seems like a really wonderful note to end on, a really nice celebrating the good work. So where can people find you, Lara? No, on where can people find Lara Mottee?
Yeah. I'm happy to connect with anyone on kind of LinkedIn. Always open to working on little projects, or if you're interested in hearing more about a project leadership or project management and this kind of what can you do in terms of getting a better social outcome, happy to have a chat with you about that as well. And lots of my papers are, of course, online as well too.
Yes,
If you do use
an
Google stuff.
award-winning sociologist
Yeah.
recently, if I remember
Yes, I did.
correctly.
Yeah, that's
Yes,
right. I got a sociologist of the month, which was wonderful.
correct.
So
Yes.
yeah,
Well, I
always.
will put those details in the comments below
Yep.
so that
Okay.
people can
Sounds great.
find you.
Yep.
And so thank you very much for taking the time. I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate it. It's been a great conversation.
It's been
Thank you.
wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you for watching. And if you're listening, thank you for listening. Remember to hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe. When you subscribe to the channel, I get more interesting guests and we can all learn, grow, and share our stories together. Thank you for listening. Remember, hit the like button, share, subscribe.